Alright, for this final Unit 6 review video, we're going to go over Brexit. So, first, before we actually talk about the details, let's make sure we're always bringing it back to the unit theme, right? First off, especially when we're evaluating the bigger question for the test TEA, right? To what extent has the European Union been a successful community? We can evaluate whether or not countries desiring to leave the EU might start to pick apart the idea that the EU is a successful community. Why would people want to leave if it's successful, right? We also want to think about what conditions might make one want to leave. Is it because it gets too big? Is it because your voice is no longer as important? Is it because maybe some of the general principles that bring the community together are becoming dismantled, right? And then in general, we could also think about our own personal experiences with this to help ourselves answer the question. Have we experienced examples like this in the past? And how might this inform our understanding of what a community is? Again, big plug. It's nice to watch other review videos besides just listening to me talk. So go ahead and click on 56 in the review slides to check out this Brexit video, which kind of gives you a sense again about how it's complicated, why it's taking so long, and then it starts to give previews about what a Brexit might look like, including talking briefly about a soft versus a hard Brexit. So check that one out. In general, why is Brexit occurring, right? So we talked about Euroscepticism in the last video. Euroscepticism is alive and well in Great Britain, and so we can think about examples of that, and also we could just think about just British exceptionalism throughout the years. The idea that Britain has always felt like it's unique. It's sort of unwilling to abandon certain unique elements of its identity to join a greater community like EU, at least in the social sense. Another economic reason why Britain has always sort of felt exceptional to the rest of the EU is that they never got rid of their currency, right? They still use the pound sterling. Um, Also, Britain has experienced an increased sense of alarm at the influx of immigrants. They were increasingly nervous when more Eastern European countries joined the EU, countries that were formerly parts of the communist Soviet bloc. And so there was sort of a general agreement that leaving the EU would be one of the only ways that the UK could curb the complications of allowing other EU citizens from freely living and working there. And the UK also thought that if they left the EU, they could have more ability to write their own immigration legislation. Another reason why we are increasingly seeing a move towards Brexit is that the economic stagnation that's been occurring throughout the EU, still lingering effects from the Eurozone debt crisis, for example, means that some of the weaker EU nations have experienced high unemployment. We talked about how in Greece, for example, unemployment can be as high as 25%. But unemployment in a nation like the UK is more like 4%. So this means that more people are going to desire to work in a place like the EU. And so this is sort of threatening to EU citizens, the idea that they might face increasing job competition and also the general fear of um, what their national identity might look like as more people from outside of the nation start to move in. And so this is one of the reasons why the idea of Brexit is a little bit confusing, right? Some members of the UK still want to maintain access to the free market, right? Or the single market rather, the market with no tariffs that allows the free flow of goods from one nation in Europe to another. There are other EU leaders, especially Angela Merkel, who say that the UK can't do this, that it can't cherry pick parts of the EU that it likes and that it doesn't like. And so that's another reason why the UK and the EU have been at odds with one another, right? That if Brexit were to be a soft Brexit, that might undermine the strength of the EU as a whole, and it might also lead to a sort of ripple effect throughout the rest of the EU, because other nations might also decide that they only want to follow parts of the EU and not all of it. We'll talk about that a little bit more next week, too. Okay, so I wanted to zero in on the third essential question of the unit, right? How does ideological change impact political change? And let's apply that to Brexit, right? What are some of the ideological changes that are happening in the UK specifically that are shaping the pro EU and anti EU arguments? All right, so in general, let's look at first the demographics of the Brexit vote, right? We're seeing that there's an increased divide of people that have a higher level of education and their opinion on Brexit. The more likely you are to have a college degree, the less likely you are to push for Brexit. So we could consider why that is. Also, the people who have a higher annual income tended to be less in favor of Brexit. So that could suggest the idea that people of working class are more scared of the possibility that their jobs are threatened, right? Um, for population density, we see that Brexit is less popular in urban areas. In particular, that's partially due to economic interconnectedness, also due to the idea that people in urban areas see maybe more of a sense of a cosmopolitan identity, one that is not necessarily restricted in within national borders. In general, cities tend to be more diverse. They tend to have more immigrants living in them, so people are more used to that idea of diversity, so more inclined to stick with that than to go back to a more sort of inward looking model. And also, what we see is that the older population tended to vote more in favor of Brexit, whereas the younger population tended to vote against it. That also gives us a sense of how the younger population does not really know a life before the EU, right? Whereas the older population is more nostalgic towards turning inward, right? Being able to shape more of its national policy on its own. So one could say that the younger population really likes what the EU has done. They like the idea that they can live and work anywhere in the EU, right? Whereas older citizens are less concerned with sort of the new freedoms that the EU brought about. Okay, so let's think about how ideological change impacts political change with a couple specific examples. So first, zooming into Scotland, right? The SNP, the Scottish National Party, was pretty much a fringe party just a few years ago, right? In other words, it was on the margins. Very few people actually voted in favor of the SNP's candidates, but they've grown in recent years to be the largest party in Scotland. And the best example of that was in 2014, they had a referendum to leave the UK, which came close to passing. And the reason why that um, was because increasingly there's a general sense of Scottish nationalism, right? The idea that Scotland is not the same as the UK, right? But nonetheless, they did vote to stay in the UK back in 2014, and that was mainly because they did not want to leave the EU. So we can only surmise what kind of issues that brings to Scotland once the Brexit referendum passed, and that also shows us how the SNP is only going to grow in popularity once Brexit is passed. So think about how the ideology towards Scottish nationalism leads to this political shift towards Scottish independence, right? And then within the UK, we could think about the rise of UKIP, the UK Independence Party, the fact that it won over a quarter of the UK's European Parliament seats in 2014 actually shows us that overall this shift towards UK nationalism, and with that also UKIP tends to be very nativist in ideology, that has overall shifted the entire UK's political agenda further to the right. For example, the only reason why the Brexit vote took place to begin with was because the former Prime Minister David Cameron promised the population that if his party, the Conservative Party, won the election of 2016, that he would let this vote occur, right? So part of that was to try to persuade people that might otherwise vote for UKIP to vote for the Conservative Party. But it backfired because they didn't expect Brexit to pass, right? So in general, we need to think about how as ideologies become more extreme, it tends to shift the politics in that direction too. And we could think about how this change in ideology has directly led to political changes like the Brexit referendum to begin with. Another big question is, and this relates back to community, right? If Brexit were to happen, do we think that Britain could truly isolate itself from the rest of Europe and the world, right? One thing we should consider is how globalization and economic interconnectedness has made it increasingly difficult to completely separate a place like the UK from the rest of Europe, even if Brexit were to occur. Right? We should think about why people who lived within the city of London voted so strongly against Brexit, right? Where the vote for Brexit was more concentrated on rural areas. So London is much more cosmopolitan in nature. It's more demographically diverse, and also the importance of economic interconnectedness suggests to us that Londoners increasingly don't see it as feasible or desirable to limit economic ties with the rest of the EU. So they seem to think that it's really difficult for this to happen. They really think that it's difficult for Britain to just completely cut itself off from the rest of the EU. They are too financially bound to one another. Also, there's a pressure of financial institutions, right? Think about who benefits more from economic interconnectedness. London's one of its biggest industrial sectors is in banking, right? And there are many, many bank headquarters in London. And if Brexit were to happen in a literal sense, that would mean that bank headquarters might relocate out of a place like London and move to other cities in the EU, like Brussels, Amsterdam, etc. So think about how that pressure from financial institutions makes it really difficult for Britain to completely sever itself from the rest of the EU. And also, we need to think about how, if Brexit were to occur, that it's still going to be connected to EU in terms of its influence, right? So, I mean, if the ideological changes towards nativism are happening in Britain and it's leading towards a major political change like Brexit, think about whether or not there could be a ripple effect across Europe. Are other nations also becoming increasingly Eurosceptic, right? Are other nations even talking about their own form of exit from the EU? The answer is yes, right? We're seeing a growth in far right, more Eurosceptic parties across Europe. France is an excellent example of that. If we think about the most recent election between the more far right nativist candidate Marine Le Pen and the ultimate winner, who was more moderate, Emmanuel Macron, we see how this is ultimately sort of showing that there could be a Brexit type ripple effect. If anything, we're seeing a trend more towards nationalism across the EU, and that is certainly influenced by what's happening in Britain. Um, Last two slides, let's talk about the pros and cons of Brexit. And then next week, we'll get into a little bit more of hard Brexit versus soft Brexit and also what Brexit means for the EU, right? And so some arguments in favor of Brexit, right? First off, the UK would be able to have more of a direct influence over its border patrols, its immigration legislation, right? In general, the people who supported Brexit want to have a much more tightly policed border, right? And one of the reasons why this is because they are increasingly intimidated by the flow of migrants and refugees, like from Syria. They are threatened by the presence of ISIS among some of these migrants, and we've seen that fear exacerbate with recent terrorist attacks in different parts of the UK and the EU. For example, the terrorist attack at the Ariana Grande concert last year. Right. So right now, the UK has to allow people from the EU to live and work within their borders. That's part of what EU membership entails. So they have little control over limiting immigrants who have come from other parts of the EU. What are some of the economic pros of Brexit? Right. There are protectionists who believe that jobs will stay in Britain if the UK leaves the EU, right? Because they fear that if the EU continues to enlarge, the jobs might relocate to countries where labor is cheaper. But there is some counter argument to that. We could argue that the economic growth that's associated with the interconnectedness of the economies also could be a job creator. But nonetheless, people of certain job industries do fear that their jobs would actually leave their country if Brexit were not to happen and the EU were to continue to enlarge. Also, people who are pro Brexit think that another economic benefit would be the freedom to negotiate trade terms with nations outside of the EU, right? Right now, that to trade with the rest of the world. As members of the customs union, the UK has to charge the exact same rates, the same tariff rates on outside nations like the US or China, the same way that other EU nations do. They have to abide by those standard policies. If they were to leave the EU, they could negotiate their own separate trade deals with these outside countries without having to listen to the EU's policies and regulations. A social reason in favor of Brexit, right, is more nationalistic, right? There are some people that fear that, the increased sort of open flow of workers to and from the UK from other parts of the EU and the world is making Britain seem less British, right? They're losing their sense of British identity. Um, Outside of London, less UK citizens, especially in the English part of the UK, right, feel more less ties to the EU and still feel like they maintain this unique British identity, right? And so that's one of the reasons why staying British is actually seen as a pro for some people. for Brexit. And then politically, the argument for Brexit is more national sovereignty, right? If the UK became independent from the rest of the EU, they would have power to make laws that were unique to Britain. And last slide, and the very last review video here is the cons, right? And so, one economic con for both, actually both in the UK and the EU, one could argue, is what this would do to trade between the UK and the EU. Right now, the EU benefits and the UK benefits from this. Half of all UK exports go straight to other EU countries. So if Brexit were to happen, consider what kind of rules changes might have to happen, right? Consider why a lot of people, a lot of Brexiters are now talking about having a soft Brexit, because if they had that, they could maintain membership within the European single market and still allow for tariff-free trading, right? There's also a fear that economically that there would be less labor movement, right? That the UK would be unable to recruit workers from other parts of the EU. Another fear of the citizens themselves is what might happen if there no longer is that freedom to live and work in any part of the EU. Would that mean all of a sudden that a UK citizen living in the EU would no longer be allowed to live and work there? Would they become immigrants? Right? And then vice versa. What's going to happen to all the EU citizens who live in the UK to work? There would have to be some sort of major policy change and a major, just sort of ability to move all these people around. That would be very, very difficult to actually implement. Right? Another con, which is interesting because it was also listed as a pro in the previous slide, so it sort of gives us a sense of how you feel about immigration as a whole. Some people think less immigration would be a con for Brexit, right? Consider why there might be certain jobs, for example, that might be less desirable for UK natives, right? Think about kind of this is sort of a bad thing to think about, but the idea that immigrants sort of fulfill some of the stoop labor positions that are less desirable among the people who are born in that country. So that's one consideration about why immigration would be good for UK citizens, right? Other UK citizens do not want to feel uniquely British, right? They want to maintain a sense of connectedness with the rest of Europe. So a social con, which just as much was a social pro for other people in the UK, was that people don't necessarily want to be isolated and separated from the rest of Europe. So isn't it interesting that something like immigration or isolation can be listed as both a pro and a con? Political worries. First off, that there's a general fear that the EU might become less stable if the UK were to leave. Think about how the UK leaving would undermine the EU's power as a whole, right? Would this lead to a ripple effect, right? Could this trigger other countries to want to leave? Also, there's a fear that it might widen the political divide in the UK, right? The UK is a number of different nations within, right? You have England, you have Wales, you have Scotland, you have Northern Ireland. And this is really significant because in general you could think about how different parts of the UK voted differently on Brexit. Scotland overwhelmingly voted to stay. So think about how this is pushing countries like Scotland to maybe even push for another referendum vote for independence. So this could actually potentially dismantle the UK as we know it as well, right? So in general, right, how do we recap all of this? I hope that these videos were helpful for you guys to understand sort of the roots of the EU, right? The first video got into also the connections between the previous unit and this one. What's up with the Syrian refugee crisis and why should we care about it in the context of the EU? I also want to remind you guys that you should be thinking about the TEA on the test as you're studying all of this, right? To what extent is the EU a successful community, right? Where are we seeing this? How can we use something like Brexit or enlargement or Euroscepticism as evidence for our TEA there? All right. So I'm going to cut it off here, right? We have everything except the last couple of things we'll talk about on Monday and Tuesday, but they'll be recent enough on your mind that I don't think you need to have a review video to go over those. So thanks so much, as always, for watching, and good luck on your test. Let me know if you have any questions about any of these. All right? Thanks.